would like to begin by stating, for the record, that my fireplace is not supposed to produce paperwork. Fire, yes. Heat, certainly. The occasional philosophical crisis, unavoidable. But invoices is itemized across multiple pantheons, written in at least 3 mutually incompatible symbolic systems, and emerging in a continuous stream from something that has recently begun to resemble a mouth. This is not traditionally part of the arrangement. And yet, here we are. The scroll has been feeding outward for approximately 6 hours. It is, I regret to report, still itemizing. This is, as these things so often are, an issue about death disputes between gods of different realms. Now death, despite centuries of enthusiastic marketing, is not actually final. It is administrative. One dies, one is processed, and one is delivered with varying degrees of ceremony to the appropriate afterlife as determined by culture, belief, circumstance, and a frankly alarming number of subclauses. And most of the time, this works. The Norse take the dramatic ones to Valhalla and leave the stubbornly attached behind as Draugr, which is less an afterlife and more a refusal to vacate the premises. The Greeks take those who die with sufficient narrative flair and sorter them accordingly, with Elysium reserved for the sort of person whose life can be retold without embarrassing Hades or Persephone. The Buddhists, rather sensibly, decline to keep anyone at all, and instead convert the whole affair into a ledger of karma, which determines what one becomes next. And most of the time, this works. Inter-pantheon disputes are rare. Not because mortals are simple, but because they are, in the main, consistent. A man tends to die in a way that clearly belongs to somewhere, but for the mortal named Gregor Vass, this was not the case. For the record, he drowned trying to save a sandwich. That is the official version, and I regret to inform you it only becomes more convincing the more you examine it. The sandwich had been prepared on a ferry from Sicily. Gregor, who approached lunch with a seriousness most nations reserve for infrastructure, was standing at the rail when a sudden gust of wind removed the sandwich from his hand and threw it into the sea. Now, a sensible person would have accepted this as a loss, and perhaps ordered another. Gregor lunged after it like Jack lunging after Rose in the Titanic. This is where things began to attract attention. In lunging, he collided with a honeymooning reenactor carrying a decorative spear, a Hellenic revival priestess holding a bowl of ritual wine, and an elderly Norwegian man who had chosen that exact moment to recite a saga to a flock of completely uninterested gulls. Gregor went over the rail, hit the water, inhaled what I am told was a historically significant portion of the Mediterranean, and died clutching a plastic bag containing olives, a saint medal, and a novelty moon charm he had purchased 3 years earlier during what his bank described, with heroic optimism, as self-care. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of it. Some local afterlife processes the case, files him under unfortunate lunch decisions, and everyone moves on. Unfortunately, several pantheon jurisdictions noticed him at once. The Norse gods insisted Gregor had launched himself with the spirit of a warrior, which was apparently enough of Valhalla to start circling the situation like it had just smelled paperwork. The Olympian side pointed out, not incorrectly, that he had died in Seawind, near ritual wine, during what could generously be described as interpersonal chaos, and therefore fell well within their jurisdiction. The saint medal by itself attracted Christian attention, though not agreement, because half of them thought he counted, and the other half had concerns about his relationship with horoscopes. At this point, it should have calmed down. Instead, the Egyptian gods filed an inquiry, which is always a bad sign, on the basis that he had died holding symbolic objects, edible goods, and what they described as a measurable concern with outcomes. A minor lunar cult claimed the moon charm created devotional proximity, and then, because the universe is fundamentally unserious in ways that ought to be illegal, a local sea deity submitted a claim arguing that Gregor had entered salt water while actively desiring food, which apparently satisfies some ancient clause about interrupted appetites and tides. There was a moment, mercifully short cosmically speaking, where Azathoth sniffed the idea of it and decided Gregor might make a perfectly adequate flutist. The universe shifted accordingly. Several realities adjusted posture. A chair became theoretical. Then Azathoth became bored and forgot. Everything snapped back into place with the relief of systems that had narrowly avoided becoming music. No one filed that either. Anyway, the problem with divine jurisdiction, once multiple pantheons had tasted the possibility of being correct at the same time, was that none of them retained the good manners to be wrong in private. Within 3 hours of Gregor Vass becoming technically deceased, the matter had escalated from speculative claim to active procedural sabotage. Valhalla had dispatched a provisional welcoming chorus, all of whom arrived armed, underdressed for the Mediterranean, and deeply convinced that drowning while lunging after lunch constituted the sort of doomed commitment from which sagas are made. Olympus objected to the chorus on the grounds that they were contaminating the atmospheric context of death. This led, almost immediately, to a dispute over whether Seawind counted as martial drama if the deceased had entered it by accident while reaching for focaccia. The Christian offices, never content to disagree with only outsiders, divided internally with the speed and confidence of an institution that had spent centuries rehearsing precisely this kind of disappointment. One camp maintained that the Saint Medal established a devotional link, however modest. Another pointed out that the same man had, by all available records, once paid a woman €12 to tell him whether Mercury in retrograde was affecting his digestion. A third group attempted to classify the matter as pastoral ambiguity, which would have been more persuasive had one of them not described Gregor in an official memorandum as spiritually porous. The Egyptian inquiry deepened. They requested inventories. They requested witnesses. They requested itemized metaphysical significance for the olives. No one had one. This did not slow them down. The lunar claimants, meanwhile, circulated a brief arguing that the novelty moon charm, though purchased ironically and 3 years earlier in what a surviving credit statement described as a difficult month, nevertheless demonstrated devotional adjacency through repeated possession. The sea deity, having begun with a minor tidal claim, grew suddenly ambitious and submitted a revised petition asserting custodial rights over all souls entering brine under conditions of interrupted appetite, emotional momentum, and unsecured lunch. This, regrettably, was not the worst of it. The worst of it was Gregor. He did not ascend. He did not descend, disperse, dissolve, awaken, transfigure, sing, repent, feast, row, kneel, or experience any of the other decorative verbs by which mortal religions attempt to domesticate the administrative violence of dying. Gregor remained where he was, which is to say, adjacent. Not in the sea, not above it, not beyond it. He existed in the spiritual equivalent of a document left open on 6 desks at once, every system insisting it had access, none capable of closing the file without provoking a complaint from the others. The ferry passengers, for their part, assumed the strange weather meant a storm was coming. They were wrong. What was coming was precedent. Now precedent is one of those things mortals imagine gods do not need, on the grounds that omnipotence surely eliminates paperwork. This is adorable. Omnipotence increases paperwork. The more power a being possesses, the more catastrophic its categorization errors become, and therefore the more obsessive it grows about clauses, subclauses, invocations, exemptions, ritual standing, symbolic contamination, seasonal waivers, and whether a man who dies while reaching for lunch has in fact performed an act of appetite, sacrifice, devotion, folly, heroism, or Mediterranean nonsense. Someone, eventually, and with the tone of a person reaching for a fire alarm in a library, cited the arbitration of composite deaths. That was an old ruling, older than most pantheons were willing to admit and younger than I found respectable. It had been invoked only in cases where the deceased had managed, through timing, symbolism, or extreme personal incompetence, to satisfy too many mutually exclusive afterlife conditions at once. The ruling was clear on one point and one point only. When no pantheon could establish sole jurisdiction without invalidating the metaphysical assumptions of the others, the matter passed to external review under eldritch authority. There was, I am told, a long silence after this was read aloud. Not because anyone objected to the wording. They objected to me. This was understandable. My kind are useful in the way acid is useful. We resolve things. The difficulty lies in what remains afterwards. Still, no one could propose an alternative that did not involve celestial litigation extending into the heat death of the universe. And the universe, contrary to rumor, does not enjoy being used as a scheduling estimate. So the petitions were gathered, the claims were sealed, Gregor was marked pending, and the whole grotesque bundle was sent upward, outward, inward, and elsewhere, according to those directions by which divine authorities describe places they would rather not map. That is how I came to be summoned to the Celestial Court of Composite Claims, which was not a place so much as a compromise under architectural duress. Imagine, if you can, a hall designed by committees who despised one another on theological grounds, but had nevertheless been forced to share a contractor. The Norse section insisted on timber so old it still resented the axe. Olympus had contributed columns, drama, and a frankly exhausting amount of white stone. The Egyptian delegation introduced symmetry severe enough to make confession feel aerodynamic. Christian representatives kept trying to improve the acoustics for choirs, while a dozen lesser cults inserted alcoves, lanterns, moon basins, tide channels, incense grates, and one unnecessary mosaic depicting fish with legal authority. None of it matched. All of it believed itself central. The result resembled a cathedral constructed during a diplomatic incident, and then abandoned halfway through for reasons of pride. I was announced 3 times, by 3 separate ceremonial offices, all of whom disliked the other's pronunciation. I did not enter. I was already there. This unsettled them, which improved my mood considerably. I was seated, if one insists on using chairs for beings whose relation to geometry is largely editorial, upon the bench of final ambiguity. a title so melodramatic I had considered striking it from the record centuries earlier, but by then it had already appeared on too many seals. Before me stood the assembled claimants, each prepared to present what they believed was the decisive reading of Gregor Vass. At the center of the chamber, suspended inside a containment field shaped by compromise and mutual suspicion, floated Gregor himself. He looked bewildered. This was encouraging. The dead are often at their most accurate when bewildered. He still held the plastic bag. The olives remained inside. The saint metal glimmered faintly. The moon charm swung in slow, ridiculous orbit. From time to time, Gregor glanced downward, as though still hoping the sandwich might reappear and justify everything. A herald from the court, a being with 6 ceremonial voices and no evident spine, opened the proceedings. "Let the matter be heard," it declared, "regarding the soul of Gregor Vass of Malta, insurance adjuster, deceased by marine submersion arising from alimentary pursuit." "Lunched for a sandwich," I said. The herald twitched. "If your immensity prefers." "I do. Continue." The first to speak were the Norse, who argued with the confidence of people who had never found understatement morally useful. Their advocate, broad as a siege engine, and furred in enough winter to insult the climate, declared that Gregor had died in active pursuit, propelled by will, motion, and disregard for consequence. A man who throws himself into the unknown for something he values, however idiotic the object, participates in the essence of heroic risk. They cited precedent involving Mead, boars, and at least one chieftain who had perished trying to retrieve a hat from ice floes. It was not their best material, but they delivered it with conviction. Olympus rose next, indignant already, which saved time. Their representative maintained that place and atmosphere governed the case. Gregor died in sea wind, amid ritual association, social chaos, and theatrical misfortune. He had collided with wine, spear, and public embarrassment before entering the water. This, they argued, was plainly a death of Hellenic flavor. They spoke of liminality, marine caprice, and the rights of civilizations to protect their own aesthetic domain from interpretive barbarism. One of them used the phrase mythic weather profile with a straight face. The Christian delegation objected to the phrase before advancing 3 incompatible arguments of their own. Gregor, they said, possessed a saint metal. He retained at least vestigial symbolic belonging. He had not renounced grace, merely diluted it with nonsense. Another faction insisted that the moon charm complicated matters. A third wanted the record to show that while Gregor had never been especially devout, he had once cried during midnight mass, and therefore remained, in a pastoral sense, morally recoverable. They seemed very proud of this. I made a note that none of them had defined recoverable. Then came the Egyptians, who did not so much make an argument as unveil an accounting. They had weighed the objects. They had assessed symbolic burden. They had measured the moral proportions of his last act against prior habits, food anxieties, practical attachments, and what they termed persistent concern with balance, fairness, and whether one had been overcharged. Because Gregor had worked in insurance, this final category occupied a dismaying amount of papyrus. Their conclusion was not that he belonged to them exactly, but that any adjudication failing to consider the meaningful arrangement of objects at death would be legally childish. The local sea deity spoke after that, and what it lacked in prestige it compensated for in appetite. Its claim was simple. Gregor entered salt water wanting food, desire unfinished, appetite interrupted, tidal possession triggered. There existed, apparently, an ancient rite of salvage over souls entering the sea in a state of thwarted consumption. It recited the clause with the smugness of a creature that had waited 6,000 years for exactly this kind of idiot. By this point, the chamber had developed the brittle atmosphere of a dinner party, at which every guest had brought a lawyer, and all of them had chosen fish. The lesser lunar cultist, pale and triumphant, rose to insist that repeated ownership of the moon charm created an accumulative devotional residue. This led to a dispute over whether buying something in a gift shop during a depressive spell constituted worship, emotional projection, or maritime consumer weakness. Gregor raised one hand very tentatively and asked whether anyone had found the sandwich. The court ignored him. I did not. An excellent question, I said. A silence followed. It moved through the chamber like a draft in old stone. The Olympians frowned. The Norse looked suspicious. The Christians adopted the facial expression common to institutions confronted with a line of inquiry both ridiculous and ruinously relevant. Only the sea deity smiled, which was unpleasant, as it had chosen a mouth that suggested prior experience with shipwrecks. The sandwich, I repeated. Where is it? The herald consulted the record, unrecovered your immensity. And this does not strike any of you as central. No one answered. This was the sort of silence in which entire civilizations revealed themselves. You are all making claims, I said, based on what the deceased intended, symbolized, touched, entered, resembled, and might under better lighting be said to have meant. Yet the object toward which all action was directed has not been entered into evidence. The Norse advocate began. With respect, the sandwich is incidental. No, I firmly corrected, trying to drive home a point. The man drowned for it. That gives it standing. The room erupted. It is one of my less celebrated gifts that I can turn a bad meeting into a worse one, simply by insisting on accuracy. Within seconds, the chamber was boiling with objections. Olympus refused to dignify lunch as an independent vector of fate. The Christians feared, not entirely without reason, that introducing the sandwich might reduce the spiritual seriousness of the case. The Egyptians demanded to know its composition. The sea deity became evasive. Gregor himself brightened visibly. I let them all shout until the noise rose to that particular pitch where meaning peels off language and drifts towards the ceiling. Then I lifted one hand. The room obeyed. This was not because I'm frightening, though that helps. It was because all courts at their core are theaters of interrupted speech, and I have always excelled at interruption. You have mistaken the matter before you, I said. They hated this already. You believe you are disputing ownership of a soul. You are not. You are disputing the narrative under which the death may be classified. The Norse want the leap. Olympus wants the setting. The Christian officers want the symbol. Egypt wants the arrangement. The sea wants the appetite. None of you are claiming Gregor Vass entire. You are claiming the angle from which his stupidity becomes meaningful. No one moved. Even the incense held its breath. Gregor did not die as one thing, I continued. He died as several mutually insulting truths at once. A man may apparently be ridiculous, sincere, symbolic, hungry, coastal, and legally contentious in the same instant. Your systems cannot process this because your afterlives were designed for conviction, not overlap. One of the Olympians, who had the exhausted cheekbones of someone born from a headache, said, Then what is your ruling? I looked at Gregor. Gregor looked at me with the tender panic of a man who had never expected his lunch to acquire metaphysical consequences. My ruling, I said, depends on the sandwich. Just then, the whole motley crew of divinity, including myself, turned to the moral just as his outline wavered. The olives jolted in their bag, somewhere far below the level of divine dignity. In the warm and frankly undertrained world of the living, a pair of mortal hands had begun striking his chest with sufficient conviction to create a cross-jurisdictional complication. The herald looked down at the record, then up at Gregor, then down again with the expression of a being watching the floor decline legal reality. Gregor convulsed once inside the containment field, made a wet and offended sound, and vanished from the court entirely as his soul was reclaimed by the oldest and most vulgar authority in existence. A body refusing, at the last minute, to finish dying. A dumbfounded silence followed. It is difficult to describe the particular fury of gods who have spent hours litigating the soul, only to discover that the man in question has coughed, swallowed half the Mediterranean, and resumed legal personhood. The sea deity demanded appeal. There was none. The lunar cult attempted provisional custody. Denied. The Egyptians requested that the matter remain open pending sandwich recovery. Tempting, but no. I closed the file. That's the shape. The grandeur gets punctured by rib pressure and seawater, which is exactly the kind of anticlimax that becomes myth because everyone involved is too embarrassed to tell it plainly. Thus ended the case of Gregor Vass, who crossed half the known boundaries of death and was returned to life because someone on a ferry remembered a first aid course and refused to let lunch become theology.